let's go ahead and dive into free response question number 3, part B, 2006. This question was interesting because it looks really difficult, and they start talking about merge sorting, but you don't actually need to know how to perform a merge sort or exactly how that works to tackle this problem. You do, however, need to be familiar with arrays. And so let's go ahead and break this question down. It says that you're given two lists, two arrays, list 1 and list 2, representing customer lists. And they've already put those in alphabetical order within the list themselves. And it says that we're going to use this method that we're going to write called Prefix Merge. And it's going to use an algorithm to perform what is essentially a merge sort. And the way it's going to work is it is going to populate the result list by comparing the two elements. And so, for example, here, I'd be comparing Arthur and Aaron. And because Aaron comes first, it would fill Aaron into the first location. And then it would go on to the second element in that list, then comparing Arthur and Baker. Well, Arthur comes before Baker, so Arthur gets placed, and we move on in the list. And that's what you see in this resulting list here, is it is going to go ahead and evaluate and compare the elements and then move along, looping through the lists and populating a new array. So the skills that this really takes into account is it's populating an array that has already been instantiated, which I show you some notes here if you want to pause the video. These are notes from CS Awesome on how we can populate and assign a new value to an array, because it's important to note they've already created the result array. It's just filled with null values, and we're going to go ahead and rewrite those. And so what they want us to do here is go ahead and write code. And a couple of notes about what we're going to need to use here. We used compare to, which is the string method, when we solved part A, which had us writing the method customer compare. And I would say it's you're going to see this trend. It's really helpful that you're going to be using methods that you wrote in previous problems. And so you need to understand how that works. Even if you couldn't code the compare customer method on the exam, when you move on to the next question, you can still call and use the method as it was intended to be written. So don't feel like, oh, I didn't necessarily get the full points on that, I don't know how to do the next part, because you can still write the next part and call it. You're not going to have the next part of the question held against you if you didn't properly code it in the part A of a particular question. I guess to kind of think about this with another problem, let's say I had the following names. I have Ben, Jen, and Zaid, and then in list 2 here I have Al, Nick, and I don't know, let's go with Wyatt. It's at the end of the alphabet. Let's call this right here list 1 and this list 2. Thinking about how I would populate this list, I'm going to compare the first element in both lists. Al comes first, and so then I'm going to compare Nick and Ben. Ben comes next, and so then I'm going to go and look at the next element. That's what we're looking at here. Now, there's a case, what if the same name is in both lists? If that occurs, what they want us to do is not duplicate any name. So we want to move on to the next name. So you can kind of see here when I'm thinking about what I'm going to need to use to solve this problem, I'm going to need to loop a certain number of times, examining elements in an array and incrementing the element in which I'm examining as I move through the list to populate a new list called the resulting list. So the first line of code we're going to write here was the method header, which was given to us. It said public static void, and this was called prefix merge. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to declare two counter variables. I'm going to call them first, and I'm going to call them second. And what this is going to do is this is going to keep my place in each array, or in each list, list 1 and list 2. Now I'm going to use a for loop, and I'm going to start it at 0. And the number of times that I want to loop is going to be the number of times in which, or the number of elements in which I need to populate result list. And that list has already been instantiated. So we are able to say result.length, because it has a length, it's just null values right now. And I'm going to increment over that. Now, let's consider making a new variable called num that's going to compare, because it said here in the problem that we want to populate the list in ascending order by customer. And we've already done that with the compare customer method. And if you remember how that method worked, it was similar to the compare to method. We look at the current object and compare it to the other object. And in the case of this Smith and Anderson example, because Smith came after Anderson, that method returned a positive integer. So again, it returned a positive integer if the current object came after the other object. And so let's go ahead and apply that idea to these lists. Let's say my current object that I'm looking at comes from list 1, and I want to look at the very first element. I'm going to use that first integer that is beginning at 0. And I can't just put 0 here, because that's going to change as I increment through the list. So list 1 first dot, and it's not going to be compare to, I'm going to use compare customer, the method that I previously wrote. And the other customer in this case is going to come from list 2, also going to be the first element in that list. Now, if num is a positive value, which we saw with the Smith and Anderson example here. So remember, if the current object came after the other object, it returned a positive integer. So if the number returns a positive integer, if number is a positive integer, what do we want to see happen? Well, that would mean that we want the list to be populated with the element from the second list, because that would mean that that came alphabetically before this element. So I'm going to say if that returned a positive value, then I want to populate the result array at location I with the element from the second list, which is so we are going to populate that element from the second list, which was list 2, and it was the element, the first element from that second list. And if that happens, so in this case, let's say list 2, I used al. What did I do? I crossed it off. I put it in the resulting list, and then I incremented to the next and then I would populate that element into my resulting list at the first location, and then I need to move to the next element by incrementing the second variable. Now, what about the other case? It's going to be an else if statement, and what if it returns a negative value? Well, in that case, you're going to use similar code here, but you're not going to be populating it with the element from the second list. It'll be from the first list, and you won't be incrementing this counter variable. You'll increment the other one. The third case that you have to take into account is what if the names are the exact same, meaning that it returns 0. You don't want any duplicates, so you need to increment both lists, and that should be hopefully enough to get you started with this problem.